My name is Henry, but tonight's letter belongs to another grandfather, one who gave until it hurt, only to discover that sometimes the people you love most will turn your sacrifices into background noise. He wrote to me because he had nowhere else to place the ache, and as I read his words, I realized it wasn't just a story. It was a story of anyone who has ever been used but not honored, present but unseen. And before I begin his letter, let me remind you, if you see yourself in these stories, if you've ever been silenced or pushed aside, go ahead and subscribe. It helps me keep sharing these voices, so none of us feel invisible anymore. Here is his letter. The first time my son told me he was getting married, I felt pride swell in my chest. He spoke fast, excited, telling me about the venue, the dress, the music, the hundreds of little details that whirled together into one big day. Then he hesitated, scratching the back of his neck the way he always did as a boy when he wanted something. "Dad," he said, "we're going to need help. Weddings are expensive." I didn't even blink. "Of course," I told him. "Whatever you need." And I meant it. I wrote the checks. One for the venue, one for the caterer, another for the flowers, because she wanted arrangements that looked like something out of a magazine. I paid for the photographer, the music, even the little gifts they'd hand out to guests as they left. Every invoice that came across his desk, I signed without complaint. When all was tallied, the number was more than I had ever imagined spending in my life. But I told myself it wasn't just money. It was legacy. It was a way of showing my son and his bride that I believed in their future, that I wanted their day to be perfect. I pictured myself sitting near the front, watching her walk down the aisle, watching him beam with pride. I imagined my granddaughter to be, someday, flipping through those photos and seeing her grandfather smiling, present, part of it all. That's what I thought I was buying, a place in their story. But when the day came, things looked different. I arrived early, dressed in the suit Eleanor always said made me look 10 years younger. I held the gift envelope in my pocket. One last surprise to help them start their new life. The usher smiled politely, handed me a program, and then one of them glanced at the chart. "You're in the back," he said. "Row 23 by the kitchen doors." I frowned, certain it was a mistake. "No," I told him gently. "I'm the father of the groom." He shrugged, helpless. "This is what's on the seating plan." And so I walked down the aisle, not to the front where family belongs, but to the back where the clatter of plates and the smell of reheated food leaked through swinging doors. I sat there as strangers filled the rows ahead of me, as laughter and whispers carried, as my son stood at the altar and never once looked back to see where I had been placed. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, applause filled the hall, and all the while I sat in the back row near the kitchen, invisible in the very wedding I had paid for. On the drive home, I kept asking myself, was it a mistake? Did they forget? Or was this their way of telling me exactly how much I mattered? The answer was written not in words, but in actions. I had been erased from the front of their story and shoved into the background. And in that moment, something in me shifted, because if I was only good enough to pay, but not good enough to be honored, then perhaps the legacy I was building needed new rules. When my son first came to me about the wedding, I saw the same nervous flicker in his eyes that I had seen when he was a boy asking for a new baseball glove. He spoke quickly, tripping over his own words, painting the picture a grand day full of flowers, music, and joy. And then he slowed, cleared his throat, and said the part one had been waiting for without even knowing it. "Dad, we're in need some help." I smiled before he even finished. "Of course," I said. "That's what fathers are for." I had been saving for years without really knowing what I was saving for. Bits of overtime pay, the checks I hadn't spent after Eleanor passed, the money that might have gone to vacations if life had been kinder. Now I knew its purpose. It wasn't just sitting in a bank account. It was waiting for this moment, for me to prove once again that I could carry him, even now that he was a man. The first check was for the venue, a sum that made my hand hesitate for a second before I signed. But as soon as I pictured the chapel, full of flowers, my son standing tall, his bride walking down the aisle, my hesitation melted. What was money compared to pride? The second check was for the catering. He called me late one night, apologizing for the last-minute request. The menu we picked is more expensive than we thought, he admitted. I laughed and told him not to worry. People don't remember the vows. I joked. They remember the food. He laughed too, but I could hear the relief in his voice. That sound alone was worth the zeros on the check. The requests kept coming. Flowers, decoration, photographers, music. Each one carried the same weight. Too heavy for him to lift alone, but light enough when I took it from him. And every time I signed my name, I told myself I wasn't just paying bills. I was buying my place in their joy. I imagined where I would sit, near the front, close enough to see every detail of her dress, to hear every word of their vows. I imagined the look on my granddaughter-to-be's face years from now, when she flipped through the wedding album and saw me in the pictures, smiling, present, honored. That vision carried me through every dollar I signed away. Sometimes I caught myself thinking of Eleanor. She would have loved the bustle of planning, the endless talk of color schemes and playlists. I imagined her sitting across from me at the table, shaking her head at the numbers, but smiling all the same. It's worth it. I could almost hear her say, it's for him. So I kept writing, check after check, sacrifice after sacrifice. And every time I placed my pen on the paper, I thought of Eleanor's voice in my ear, reminding me that love doesn't count costs. It just gives. But even as I paid, small shadows crept in. I noticed that I wasn't asked about the plans beyond the bills. No one showed me the flower arrangements, or asked if I wanted to taste a menu, or invited me along when they picked out the venue decorations. My role was clear. Write the check, stay in the background. At first, I brushed it aside. It's their day, I told myself. My job is just to help. And in a way, I believe that. Parents give so their children can shine. That's what love looks like. But love also needs acknowledgement. Love needs presence. And though I didn't want to admit it at the time, I was beginning to feel the faint chill of absence. Still, I pressed on. One night, after paying a deposit for the band, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat at the table staring at the receipts. The numbers added up to more than I had ever imagined spending on anything in my life. For a brief moment, panic flickered. How much was too much? Then I pictured my son's smile, his bride's gratitude, the applause as they kissed at the altar, the photos that would last for generations. And I whispered aloud, it's worth it. It has to be worth it. I folded the receipts into a drawer, closed it firmly, and told myself that someday soon I would look back and know that every dollar was a seed planted in love. What I didn't know then was that those seeds were being planted in soil that would never let me grow roots. The morning of the wedding, I woke earlier than usual. The air felt crisp, alive with promise. I pressed my suit one more time, polished my shoes until I could see my face in them, and slipped a small gift envelope into the inside pocket of my jacket. It contained more money than I could afford, but that didn't matter. It was their day. I wanted it to begin with abundance, not limits. As I stood before the mirror, I thought of Eleanor. She used to say that weddings were sacred because they reminded people of what love was supposed to look like. I imagined her standing behind me, straightening my tie, whispering, "Be proud today. This is your moment, too." I smiled at the reflection, half at myself, half at her ghost. The drive to the venue was filled with anticipation. Every mile brought a rush of images. My son beaming in his suit, his bride radiant in white, the sound of violins filling the air. And in those images, I was always there, seated near the front, watching with a smile wide enough to split my face. When I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed how full it was. Cars lined the street, guests milling about in fine clothes, chatter filling the air. The venue itself was breathtaking, an old stone hall draped in white silk, flowers spilling from every corner, the kind of place you only see in magazines. I felt a surge of pride. My money had helped create this beauty. My sacrifice had made this moment possible. I walked through the doors, head held high, and handed my name to the usher at the seating chart. He scanned the list, nodded, and handed me a program. Row 23, sir. By the kitchen doors. For a moment, I didn't understand. "No," I said gently. "There must be a mistake. I'm the father of the groom." He checked the chart again, then shrugged, apologetic but firm. This is where you've been placed. I stood frozen, the noise of the crowd rushing past me. Guests laughed. Children darted through the aisles. Photographers snapped pictures. But all I could hear were those words. Row 23. By the kitchen doors. My steps felt heavy as I walked down the aisle, not toward the altar, but toward the back where the smell of food drifted through swinging doors and the clatter of plates punctuated every moment. I sat down, my chair wobbling slightly on the uneven floor. From there, I could see the altar, but only just. Heads bobbed in front of me, hats and shoulders blocking my view. I craned my neck, but I still caught only glimpses. My son adjusting his tie, the bride's dress sweeping down the aisle, the shimmer of rings under the lights. Every cheer, every gasp of joy reached me muffled, filtered through distance and the clanging of trays behind me. At one point, a server burst through the kitchen doors, carrying a tray of glasses. The doors swung open with a crash, laughter spilling out from inside the kitchen. The smell of garlic and reheated meat filled the air around me. Guests turned their heads in irritation. Some even whispered, fanning their faces. But none of them realized the cruel irony, that I, the father of the groom, the man who paid for this entire spectacle, had been placed in the one seat guaranteed to be interrupted by clatter and steam. I glanced around. In the front rows, strangers sat comfortably, snapping photos, leaning close to see the details. My son's colleagues, distant relatives of the bride, people whose names I barely knew had been given the seats I thought were mine. And me? I was in the shadows, near the kitchen, my program damp with sweat in my hand. I tried to focus on the vows, straining to hear the words as they echoed down the hall. My son's voice trembled with emotion. Her voice rang like a bell. People dabbed at their eyes, reached for tissues, clasped hands. I wanted to cry too, but not from joy, because every word they spoke about love and family and unity seemed to pass me by, as though I wasn't part of it, as though I were just another guest who happened to wander in from the street. And then, as the applause filled the hall, I realized something that cut deeper than anything else. My son never once looked back to see me. Not once. I clapped when everyone clapped. I smiled when everyone smiled. I did everything expected of me, even though inside I was breaking. And as I sat there, listening to the clatter of dishes and the muffled joy from the front rows, a thought began to take root. Maybe this was my place to them. Not at the front, not in the pictures, not in the story. Just in the back, by the kitchen, invisible. But if that was how they saw me in life, I would make sure they never had control over my legacy in death. After the ceremony ended, guests poured into the reception hall. The music struck up, laughter bubbled to the crowd, and the smell of food filled the air. I followed slowly, hoping maybe this part of the evening would be different, that perhaps someone would finally pull me forward where I belonged. But no one did. My seat was still in the back, tucked beside the swinging kitchen doors. The servers rushed past me with trays of appetizers, bumping my chair, muttering apologies without looking me in the eye. The clatter of dishes behind the doors drowned out the soft music from the band. Every toast, every joke from the head table, reached me a second later, muffled and distorted, as if I weren't part of the same celebration. I unfolded my napkin, laid it across my lap, and stared at the empty chair beside me. For a moment, I imagined Eleanor sitting there, her hand resting gently on mine, whispering, "It's okay. We know who you are. We know what you've given." But she wasn't there. Instead, the only company I had was the constant crash of plates and the occasional whiff of grease and steam from the kitchen. From where I sat, I could see the head table clearly lit at the front. My son looked radiant, his bride glowing in her gown. Glasses clinked as people toasted their happiness. I watched as strangers leaned in close, laughing with them, snapping photos, taking up the space I thought was mine. Every time a camera flash went off, I wondered, would I even appear in the album? Or would I be nothing more than a shadow in the corner, cropped out, forgotten? The father of the groom should be standing, making a speech, clinking his glass with pride. But no one called my name. No one invited me to speak. I was an afterthought in the very event I had funded. When the first dance began, the lights dimmed. I craned my neck to see past the crowd. catching only glimpses of their faces as they swayed. Applause thundered, and I clapped too, but the sound of a tray crashing behind me nearly drowned me out. I sat there, clapping alone, wondering how it was possible to feel so small a room I had paid to fill with joy. As dinner was served, my plate arrived last, lukewarm from the wait by the kitchen doors. I forced a smile as the server placed it down, but inside I felt the sting. Around me, laughter grew louder, people leaning across tables, glasses raised high. And there I was, chewing in silence, my table nearly empty, my chair rattling every time a door swung open beside me. At one point, I saw my son glance toward the back. Our eyes met for half a heartbeat. I thought maybe he would wave, maybe he would signal for me to join him. But then his bride leaned in, whispered something, and his eyes shifted away. That single look, or rather the lack of it, cut deeper than any words. I excused myself midway through the meal and walked outside. The night air was cool, carrying the faint hum of music and laughter from inside. I leaned against the stone wall of the hall, staring up at the stars, and whispered, "What am I doing here?" I had given everything, my savings, my time, my love, and for what? To sit in the back row like an unwanted guest? To be hidden by doors that slammed in my face every time a server rushed through? It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about what the seat represented. I wasn't family to them. I was a sponsor, a wallet with a name, useful when checks were needed, invisible when gratitude was due. I stayed outside for a long time, long enough that the speeches ended and the music grew louder. Guests spilled onto the patio, laughing, glasses in hand. I overheard them say how beautiful the wedding was, how generous the bride's family had been. My name was never mentioned. Not once. I went back in to gather my things, and as I passed the head table, I heard my son's colleague raise his glass. To the couple and to the families who made this possible. Everyone cheered. I clapped too, but no one looked at me. Back in my car, I sat in silence before turning the key. The envelope of my final gift pressed against my chest, heavy and hot. I had planned to hand it to them with a smile, maybe even slip it into their hands during a dance. But now it stayed in my pocket, unopened, unmentioned. Driving home, the headlights cut through the darkness, but all I could see was a back row, the chair by the kitchen, the look in my son's eyes when he turned away. I whispered into the empty car, "If this is where I stand in their joy, then they will not stand at the center of my legacy." And for the first time, I began to think seriously about rewriting not just my role in their story, but their role in mine. When I got home that night, I set my jacket across the back of a chair and left it there, the envelope still in the pocket. I didn't have the strength to take it out. For hours I just sat in silence, staring at the shadows on the wall. The echo of clattering plates and muffled laughter still rang in my ears. I thought weddings were supposed to be memories you carried with warmth. But all I carried was the sting of being placed where no one could see me. The next morning, sunlight streamed to the curtains, too bright, too cheerful for how I felt. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, but every sip turned bitter in my mouth. My mind replayed the night. The usher's shrug, the wobbling chair, the glance of my son that ended before it began. Row 23 by the kitchen. That phrase felt branded into me. I tried to distract myself with chores. I mowed the lawn, swept the porch, even polished the silver Eleanor had left behind. But no matter what I did, the memory kept pushing through, raw and uninvited. 2 days later, a neighbor stopped me at the mailbox. "I heard the wedding was beautiful," she said, beaming. The bride's family really outdid themselves. I forced a smile, nodded politely. My throat tightened as I thought, the bride's family and me, but no one saw me. Her words weren't meant to wound, but they did, because that's what erasure feels like. It isn't always loud, but it cuts deeper when the silence confirms it. At church the following Sunday, people asked about the big day. How was it? Did you get emotional watching your son at the altar? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to answer. It was nice. Nice. That word tasted like ash. But what else could I say? That I was hidden by swinging kitchen doors? That every speech about family and gratitude passed over me like I wasn't there? that strangers sat in the seats where my face should have been seen. So I kept the truth locked behind a polite smile. At night, though the mask fell, I would sit in the recliner, the program from the wedding still folded in my pocket. I'd unfold it, trace my name down to row 23, and feel the bitterness rise again. It wasn't just about one evening. It was about what it meant. That in their eyes, my value was measured in dollars, not dignity. I remembered every check I had written. The venue, the catering, the music. Each one had felt like planting a seed of love. But what grew from those seeds wasn't love, it was entitlement. They had taken my sacrifices and built a garden where I was not welcome to walk. One evening I pulled out old photo albums. Pictures of my son as a boy, grinning with cake smeared across his face, Eleanor standing behind him with her arm around my shoulder. Pictures of Christmas mornings, of scraped knees bandaged, of school projects we worked on together at the kitchen table. I stared at those images, tried to reconcile the boy in those photos with the man who let me sit in the shadows at his wedding. The gap between them felt like an abyss. I whispered into the empty room. Where did you go? Where did we lose each other? No answer came, only silence. Friends called later that week, telling me how wonderful the reception had been. They praised the music, the food, the flowers. One even said, "Your son is lucky to have in-laws who could make it all happen." I clenched my teeth, nodded to the phone, and hung up quickly. They didn't know. How could they? To them, I was just another guest. To them, I wasn't a man who emptied his savings to build the day. I was invisible. That invisibility began to change me. I moved through the days slower, quieter. I didn't linger in town, didn't stay long after church. I found myself pulling back from conversations, afraid someone would mention the wedding again. But when I pulled out the receipts, the folder of invoices, the total I had paid, I didn't just see money. I saw proof. Proof that I had given more than anyone. Proof that their joy had been built on my back. And with that proof came a realization. If they could erase me in life, they would certainly erase me in death. I went to the drawer where I kept my will. The papers had gathered dust, untouched since Eleanor passed. I ran my hand over the folder, my fingers trembling. For years, I had assumed everything would go with my son and through him to his family. That was the natural order of things. That was legacy. But legacy without respect is just fuel for the same fire that burned me that night. I closed the drawer without opening it, but the thought stayed with me. The wound deepened further when photos from the wedding were posted online. A friend sent me a link, cheerful. Look at these wonderful pictures. I clicked, scrolling slowly. My son radiant, his bride glowing, guests laughing, dancing, celebrating. I searched for myself. Scroll after scroll, frame after frame, nothing. When I finally found me, it was a blurry shot in the background, my face half hidden, the kitchen door swinging open beside me. That was my legacy in their wedding, a shadow by the kitchen. I sat back on the screen, my chest tight. For the first time, anger began to burn hotter than grief. Not a wild, raging anger, but a slow, steady fire. They can erase me from the photos, I whispered, but they will not erase me from the story I leave behind. And that's when the thought became something more. Not just an idea, but a plan. I would not let the people who humiliated me inherit the fruits of my sacrifice. I would rewrite the rules of my legacy, just as they had rewritten the rules of family that night. The wound had cut deep, but it was from that wound that resolve began to grow. The week after the wedding stretched like a gray fog. I thought maybe my son would call, that he'd apologize for the seating, for the oversight, for the insult that still sat heavy in my chest. But the phone never rang. Every time it buzzed, my heart leapt, only to sink when I saw it was a spam call, or a reminder from the pharmacy, or a neighbor asking about the lawn. Days turned into weeks, and still silence. I told myself at first, they're busy, they're newlyweds. Give them time. But deep down I knew silence is not forgetfulness. Silence is deliberate. Silence is a door slowly closing. At church, people came up smiling, eager to share their admiration. The wedding was beautiful, they said. The bride looked like a princess. I nodded, forced a polite smile, but my stomach tightened each time. Because I knew what they didn't, that I had sat in the shadows, listening to the clatter of dishes instead of owls, smelling kitchen grease instead of flowers. One woman said, "The bride's family really knows how to put on a show." I nearly choked. The bride's family and me, but my name was never spoken. I wanted to shout, it was me. I paid for it. The hall, the flowers, the food. I signed every check. But the word stayed locked in my throat. Because the cruelest part of erasure is how polite it looks on the outside. No one sees it but you. The photos started circulating online a week later. I opened a gallery on my computer, scrolling slowly. Image after image of smiling faces, pose embraces, champagne toasts. My son glowing, his bride radiant, her parents beaming beside them. I searched for myself. Nothing. When I finally appeared, it was one blurred shot, my head half turned, a tray of drinks blocking half my body. The caption read simply, "Guests enjoying the evening." Guests, not father of the groom, not benefactor, not family, just a guest, faceless, anonymous. I closed the browser, my chest hollow. Friends asked when I'd see the newlyweds again. I shrugged, muttered something vague. The truth was, I hadn't been invited over once. Not for dinner, not for coffee, not even for a quick visit. The silence grew heavier. I started walking in the evenings, trying to clear my head, past the park where I used to push my son on the swings, past the diner where Eleanor and I once celebrated our anniversaries. Everywhere I went, memories followed, reminding me of how much I had given, how much I had carried. And the more I walked, the clearer it became. What happened at that wedding wasn't an accident. It was a message. One evening, as I returned from a long walk, I passed a neighbor's house. Music drifted out from an open window. The laughter of family gathered around a dinner table. I stopped on the sidewalk, listening. It was a sound of belonging, of being wanted, of being seen. And I realized how long it had been since I felt that. The last time had been years ago, when Eleanor was still alive. She had a way of pulling me into the center, making sure no one forgot who had built the ground beneath their feet. She would have never let me be hidden in the back row. I whispered her name into the night. "Eleanor, what would you have me do?" The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment, I imagined her answer. "Stand tall. Don't let them write you out." The aftermath of the wedding wasn't loud. No fights, no confrontations, no harsh words exchanged. It was quieter than that, and far crueler. It was silence that cut deeper than shouting ever could, because silence meant they didn't see me as necessary. I tried calling once more, weeks later. My son answered, voice rushed. "Hey, Dad, sorry, can't talk now. We'll call you soon." But the call never came. The next time I dialed, it went to voicemail. I didn't bother leaving a message. The envelope from the wedding still sat on my dresser, unopened. I couldn't bring myself to hand it over, not after the way they'd treated me. Some nights I would pick it up, feel the weight of the cash inside, and wonder if it was a symbol of love or just proof of my foolishness. Because that's what it felt like now. Foolish. To believe money bought belonging. To believe sacrifice guaranteed respect. One night, I took out my will again. I spread the pages across the table, the lamplight pooling over the ink. My name in one place, my son's in another. For years, it had seemed so obvious. Everything would pass to him, to his family. That's what fathers do. But fathers also protect dignity. And what dignity was left if I handed my legacy to people who had erased me in life? I stared at the papers until my eyes blurred. For the first time, the thought didn't just creep in. It shouted. They cannot inherit what they refuse to honor. The aftermath stretched for months, but the seed of resolve grew stronger with every week of silence. I began to write letters. Not to them. They would only throw them away. But to myself, to Eleanor, to my future. Letters about what legacy should mean, about what love without respect turns into, about how easily sacrifice becomes invisible when people choose not to see it. I sealed them in envelopes, dated them, and placed them in the drawer beside my will. They were reminders that I was still here, still writing my story, even if they tried to write me out of theirs. That was the aftermath. A season of silence, of empty chairs and unanswered calls. But it was also the season where I began to realize that being invisible in their lives didn't mean I had to be invisible in my legacy. They might control the seating chart at the wedding, but I controlled the inheritance chart of my estate. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. When the time came, the rules would not be theirs. They would be mine. The day I decided to act, the air outside felt different, heavier, sharper, like even the wind knew something was about to change. I woke before dawn, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the folder that held my will. For months it had been a silent companion. Pulled out, studied, then tucked away again. But this morning I didn't close the drawer. I pulled the folder out, spread the pages across the table, and looked at the ink that had once seemed so permanent. My son's name stared back at me, bold and certain, as if it had always belonged there. But now it looked foreign, undeserved. I whispered aloud, "I gave you everything, and you sat me by the kitchen doors." The bitterness rose again, but beneath it was something stronger, resolve. By mid-morning, I picked up the phone and called Martin, the lawyer who had guided me through Eleanor's estate. His voice was calm, steady. "What can I do for you, Henry?" "I need to make changes," I said simply. "Big ones." He paused for a moment, then replied, "Come in tomorrow. Bring the old documents." When I hung up, my hands trembled, not from doubt, but from relief. For the first time since the wedding, I felt like I was moving forward. That night, I sat in the recliner with Eleanor's photo in my hands. She smiled back at me, her eyes kind, timeless. "You'd understand," I murmured. "You always said dignity matters more than comfort." Well, this is my dignity. This is my line. I imagine her nodding, encouraging me, telling me I wasn't wrong to draw the boundary. And for the first time in months, I slept without dreams of kitchen doors swinging in my face. The next day, Martin's office felt familiar, almost comforting. Leather chairs, bookshelves lined with case files, the smell of old paper and coffee. He greeted me with a firm handshake, studied my face, and said quietly, "You've been carrying something heavy." I nodded, laying the folder on his desk. "I paid for a wedding," I said. "Every bill, every detail." And when the day came, they sat me in the back row by the kitchen. Not family, not honored, just hidden. If they see me that way in life, then I won't let them claim me in death. Martin adjusted his glasses, his eyes soft but firm. "What do you want to do?" And so we began. Line by line, I told him my wishes. The estate would bypass my son and his wife entirely. No control, no access, no authority. Instead, the trust would be reshaped to flow directly to causes and people I chose. First, I named my granddaughter, not through them, not in their hands, but in a fund that would unlock only when she came of age. No gatekeepers, no middlemen, only her and the proof of my love. Second, I added a clause for the local church, a gift Eleanor would have wanted. She had always believed in giving back, in lifting others up, a scholarship fund too, in her name, for children who dreamed of education but couldn't afford it. Finally, I wrote clauses to protect the legacy from interference. If anyone tried contest, if anyone dared to twist my intentions, their rights would dissolve completely. "This way," Martin said, his pen scratching across the paper, "you're ensuring your voice is louder than theirs, even when you're gone." I nodded, a weight lifting from my chest. When the papers were ready, Martin slid them across the desk. "All that's left is your signature." I stared at the lines, at the blank spaces, waiting for ink. My hand hovered for a moment, heavy with the years of love and betrayal that had led me here. "This isn't revenge," I whispered, half to Martin, half to myself. "It's respect. It's dignity." Then I pressed the pen down and signed. The ink flowed smooth, final. Each letter felt like a boundary drawn, a wall built, a door locked behind me. When I finished, I set the pen down and exhaled. "It's done," I said quietly. Martin smiled faintly. "It's done." Driving home, I passed a park where my son once played as a boy. The swings were empty, rocking gently in the breeze. For a moment I saw him there, small again, calling out for me to push him higher. My throat tightened, but I didn't stop, because that boy was gone, and the man he had become had chosen to erase me. Back at the house, I placed a new folder in the drawer where the old one had been. On top of it, I set Eleanor's bracelet, the one I had once thought I'd give to my daughter-in-law, as a symbol of unity. Not anymore. Now it was a symbol of choice. Of my choice. That night, I sat at the desk with my journal. I wrote slowly, carefully, as though the words themselves were bricks in the foundation of a new legacy. They sat me in the back row by the kitchen. They treated me as invisible. But from this day forward, I decide who sees me. I decide who carries my name. The trust is mine. The rules are mine. And dignity is mine to keep. I closed the journal, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark, letting the silence wash over me. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of rejection. It was the silence of peace. I used to believe that money could buy respect, that sacrifice would be remembered, that giving would secure a place at the table. But the wedding taught me otherwise. That night, as I sat near the kitchen doors with steam and noise spilling around me, I realized something I had been avoiding for years. People who refuse to see you will never change their vision, no matter how much you give them to look at. In the weeks since changing my will, I have felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. It's not the peace of reconciliation or forgiveness. It's the peace of knowing I drew a line and stood by it. For years, I let my love blind me to the truth. I told myself that if I just gave more time, money, patience, I would finally be honored. But honor doesn't come from giving. It comes from respect. And when respect is absent, no amount of sacrifice can conjure it. I think often of Eleanor. She had a way of seeing the truth before I did. She would have said, "Henry, love is not a ledger. You don't get respect by adding up columns of generosity." She would have told me that love without dignity becomes charity, and charity without acknowledgement becomes humiliation. The wedding was humiliation. Quiet, polite, disguised with flowers and music. But humiliation all the same. And that's why I acted. Not to punish, not to wound, but to protect what little dignity still belonged to me. I imagine my granddaughter someday, older, wiser, asking questions her parents cannot answer. She will wonder why her grandfather wasn't in the photos, why he wasn't in the speeches, why he wasn't seated near the altar. And she will hear their excuses, their half-truths. But then she will open a drawer or an envelope or a letter with my name on it. She will see the provisions I made, the choices I left behind, and she will know the truth, that even when I was pushed to the back row, I was still thinking of her future, that I loved her enough to fight against erasure. Because family is not defined by who sets the seating chart. Family is defined by who shows up, who sacrifices, who keeps their promises. I kept mine. They may have sat me near the kitchen, but they will never sit me outside my own story. To anyone hearing these words, I want you to know you're not defined by where others place you. Maybe they sat you in the back. Maybe they cropped you out of the photos. Maybe they took your gifts but not your presence. But none of that erases your worth. You have the right to decide your legacy. You have the right to draw the line. You have the right to say, you cannot inherit what you refuse to honor. And when you claim that right, you take back your power. I no longer dream of being at their table. I no longer ache for invitations that will never come. My peace does not depend on their acknowledgement. It depends on the truth that I have written into the very fabric of my legacy. When they read my will someday, they may be shocked. They may call it unfair, ungrateful, unkind. But I know the truth. It is not unfair to protect dignity. It is not ungrateful to guard against humiliation. And it is not unkind to demand respect. It is justice. The kitchen doors may have clattered beside me that night, but in my heart, I have moved to the front row. I no longer sit in the shadows. My choices have placed me at the center of my own story, where I belong. And so I leave these words behind, not just for my granddaughter, but for anyone who has ever been erased. You matter, even if they sit you in the back row, even if they close the doors in your face, even if they take your gifts and give you nothing in return. You matter. Don't let them define your worth. Don't let them decide your place. Write your own rules, draw your own legacy, and know that dignity, once claimed, can never be taken away. They put me near the kitchen that night, but when it comes to my legacy, I sit at the head table.